session for my little bit today. And so what we're going to talk about is engaging students through active cognitive tasks. And I'll introduce myself very briefly. I'm a lecturer in learning and teaching at Aberystwyth University, and I'm part of the Learning and Teaching Enhancement Unit, and I'm the lead on our postgraduate certificate in teaching in higher education. So my students are new staff members or maybe postgraduate teaching assistants who are teaching. So that's who I teach. And this session today is an outgrowth of the training sessions I designed to help not only my PG Cert folks, but general university staff when the pandemic began and we all had to move to teaching online. But it's not limited to teaching online at all. So what I hope after the end of my little session today, I hope you will be able to design active cognitive tasks in your own teaching context. And everybody will probably have something different, but I'm hoping you'll be able to do that. So the next thing is, I want to ask about your own starting point. So I've created a Vivox poll for this, and I've given you several different ways. I put the link directly in the chat, or you can scan the QR code, and I'm going to, let's see, what I really want to do is I want to switch. I'm going to stop sharing this for just a moment. The link is in the chat. I'm going to share a different screen. I did make it slightly complicated for myself, but that hopefully is okay for you. So this is the Vivox poll. Fantastic. I'm so happy to see you guys putting your own answers there. Just what is it to you? What does it mean to you? Applying theory to task involving students, working through an example. That's a really good example. Yep, learning by doing. Yep, involving students, learner engagement, meaning making. That's a really good one. Yeah. The student does. I think that's really important that it's an active verb, not just understand the knowledge, but what you do with knowledge. Really good point. Fantastic. Excellent. So now I'm going to go on to the next question. Let's see. I've got loads of different tabs and things open. What I want to do is I want to stop that poll and I'll open up the next one. And so you should see a new question appearing. So now you should see something like this, and I can see that. I should be able to see the answers here. I want to show the results. So how can we tell that our students are learning actively? And this is one of the questions we used in the LTHE chat session recently. Yeah, engaged. How do we know they're engaged? How do we see that engagement? They ask questions, present to others. These are really good answers, yeah? You can feel free to elaborate. Yeah. You don't need to, I see answers appearing and disappearing. There's no wrong answer, so don't worry about that. Curious. Yeah, asking questions, sharing tasks, demonstrating the new skill. Yeah, that's really important. We can observe them doing it, whether it's assessed or whether it's not assessed. Yeah, really nice answers. Yep, so an example could be designed to throw up further questions that the student should ask and learn about by doing the task. That's a really good one. Yeah, activities and quizzes. Yeah, we can do a really quick classroom assessment technique or a Vivox poll or something like that. Yep, really, really nice. So I'm going to stop that poll. We have one more which we'll come back to at the end. And I'm going to go back to, let's see, I'm going to stop sharing that, and I'm going to go back to sharing my PowerPoint. And we'll work through some things about, let's see, there we go, fantastic. So I've collected a few examples of definitions of active learning, and what's interesting is that everybody who defines it a little bit differently. So the seminal work on active learning is Bonwell and Asen from more than 30 years ago, Active Learning, Creating Excitement in the Classroom. And here is their definition for active learning. So they focus on higher order thinking tasks. So some of you will recognize Bloom's taxonomy has the top levels on Bloom's taxonomy are often identified as higher order thinking. And then they put it in really plain English, which I like, doing things and thinking about what they're doing. But I think this is a good starting point. It may not be the stopping point for a definition, though, because what kind of thinking are we talking about here? So that's really what the active cognitive tasks is about, the type of thinking. So here's some other definitions from the Active Learning Network. And if you guys don't know about this group, I strongly recommend that you look into their website and join the group, attend their events. I found them personally very inspiring, and it's a very welcoming community as well. So Tab Betts, who's one of the founding members of the network, this is his definition. Rather than the teacher transmitting knowledge, the student needs to produce observable evidence of their learning. So that's a lot of what you talked about just now in the how do we know our students are learning actively. So all that fits together really nicely. And then Betts also focuses on the higher order thinking skills, and he's got some other examples in there. So this is very much consistent with Bonwell and Asen. And then this other definition is also on the Active Learning Network webpage, but it's from University of Michigan. And so here they take a slightly different angle. They're looking at activities. What are the activities we want our students to do? Then again, they focus right back on that higher order thinking, analysis, synthesis, evaluation. Those of you who know Bloom's taxonomy, which I imagine probably everybody, most of you do, there it is right there. And they also emphasize cooperative learning. So we're going to look at that in a moment. So these are three definitions. They're not identical, but they have some commonalities. So there's no one right answer for what is active learning, but these are some ideas we can take on board. So if there's active learning, there's passive learning. And the challenge for us as educators is to find out ways, identify where is our learning really more passive and how can we make it more active. So I am sure many of you have had your students either watch a video or come to lecture. And if that's all we tell them about that, then that in itself is passive. Your most motivated students will create their own active cognitive tasks, and they will design a task, whether they know it or not, that will help them to engage actively. But if we don't, for the students in the middle and the ones who need it the most, if we don't tell them, they might not know what they need to do to get the most out of a lecture or a video. So here are just three possible ideas you could use with that. These are not the beginning, it's just something to get you started thinking. So maybe you want your students to define the key terms in their own words. As you're going through, you're introducing some new concepts, here's a key term. So you want them to identify the definitions and put them in their own language. Maybe you want students to find real world examples, and I think we heard a lot about that in connection with the previous talk, I think, with industry and work, learning that's preparing students for the workplace. You're looking at real examples. Maybe you want students to actively link the new ideas to prior knowledge. That's a really solid cognitive science evidence-based strategy. So what about reading? So that's what they do when they're in class with us or online or in person. What about reading? I mean, we all want our students to read. Sorry, this is my cat, Arthur. You might see him on the camera. He gets excited when I get excited. So yeah, we assign reading, but what do we want them to do? Not just read the article, memorize it, give it back to us on a test. That's not very meaningful. That's, so how can we help our students to get the most from reading? we can tell them, I'd like you to evaluate the argument, see if the evidence supports the conclusions, maybe find the best out of 3 articles, which one's most persuasive and why. So you've given them an active cognitive task to do around the reading, which otherwise could be just passive. Maybe you want them to think of ways to apply the new ideas in practice. That's kind of similar to the real world examples. So they're linking the theory and the abstract concepts to something concrete that they can relate to. Maybe you want them to identify the new terms and then practice recalling and explaining them. That's a really simple activity, but that can help to drive that information into their longer term memory where they can do something, you know, more meaningful. So if I go to the doctor, I don't want the doctor to look at my leg and say, is that the tibia or the fibula? I want the doctor to know, right? So anyway, so that's the kind of thing you might do. These are only starting points, just some ideas to get you started. So this idea of active cognitive tasks, it emerged in the training sessions that I designed for staff here at Aberystwyth. And I responded to a call for proposals, and I wrote a chapter for a CEDA focus book. CEDA is the Staff and Educational Development Association. And Wendy Garnham and Isabel Gowers are the editors of this book, which was published this year in February. So this is my basic model that I propose based on being involved with active learning for quite a long time now. So if it's an active cognitive task, what do we mean by active? It's active, not passive. Students need to own the learning process, and for that to happen, we need to have mutual trust between the teacher and the students, and maybe, but really, I would say, not maybe, definitely, between the students and other students. And the students need to have agency to make their own decisions. So they're taking responsibility for their own learning. If we send a message to our students that it's all on the teacher, you just sit back, you know, you don't have to do anything, then you know, we've set them up to do passive learning, not active learning. So what makes it cognitive? It's not just the doing, but thinking. And the kind of thinking we want them to do, and this is based on, I'm not a cognitive scientist, but I became a very big fan of this body of literature starting from 8 years ago, 10 years ago. Constructing mental schemas by reinforcing connections. That's a really key part to making the cognitive process that happens in their minds that will enable them not just to remember, but to be able to use and understand quite deeply. So we want to put this new information into meaningful long-term memory. And 2 terms that are out there, I would, you're familiar, you might be already familiar with them, but if you're not, I suggest you have a look. Effortful learning and desirable difficulty. Say what kind of difficulty, why a cognitive task feels hard. If it feels hard for the right reasons, it means it's working. The learning is taking place. So that's what makes the difficulty desirable. It's not just putting extra obstacles in your students' learning, but the deeper processing feels hard. And sometimes that can put students off. But if we're transparent with our students about why we want them to do certain things, then they can say, oh yeah, that makes sense now, I'll do it. And there are some really wonderful evidence-based case studies on that. And then finally, it's a task. So they're doing something. They're not trying to just passively absorb information. They're not going through the motions of carrying out a procedure or an operation of some kind, but they need to really engage with it. So what I would argue here with the task is it's not the content of the task so much, but what the students do with that new knowledge that matters the most. So that's the active cognitive task. You can call them acts. I kind of like that. That was an accident, by the way. So models for designing acts. I came up with 3 that I found very useful. To find out how active it is, ICAP, and I'll show you a slide on that in a moment, is based on these 3 categories of active learning. How cognitive is it? Higher order thinking, that came through with all of those definitions. And these are, I would argue, the top 4. From Bloom's taxonomy. And then for a task, how do you get ideas for the task? I find the ABC learning design model is very, very useful. So I'm going to talk about the task here and show you this is that model. If you have a chance to attend any of their sessions, Young and Paravish are the developers of this based on Diana Larlard's work with types of learning. I highly recommend it. So they have 6 types of learning, and one activity might incorporate more than one type of learning. So acquisitions, where the student absorbs new information. That's the only one that could be passive if you don't add anything else to it. So that would be the reading, watching the video. Collaboration is where students work together to make something, do something towards a shared aim. Discussion, they'll probably have to discuss in order to collaborate. Discussions where they're talking to each other, that not necessarily towards a particular aim, but it could be. Investigation is where they're going out, they're finding out new information. Practice, practicing a skill, whether it's making spreadsheets for business analysis or designing, you know, an AI, generative AI thing, whatever it might be. And then production, of course. So practice is on the skill level, and production is where you're bringing all this together to make something, do a synthesis. So if you're thinking about these in your module, your own teaching context, you would have a different balance of among these 6 types of learning depending on your context. So it might look like this, it might look like this. There's no right or wrong answer for what is the right balance, but the idea of this model is to get you thinking about all 6 of these. What do I need for this particular teaching context to help my students? And that will help you to design the task. So making it cognitive, I think we've talked about this already. The top 4 levels in Bloom's taxonomy I would consider as higher order thinking. So they make something, they synthesize, they evaluate, maybe they evaluate data, they draw some conclusions, they might analyze. So if they're evaluating, it would be some kind of judgment, usually a value judgment. Analyzing is just analyzing the data. So if you're doing the higher ones, you're doing the ones below as well. And at the bottom level of what I consider higher order thinking is apply. Taking this new knowledge, applying it to a new situation to solve a problem. You guys talked a lot about problem solving. That is a really good example of applying. So it would be specific to whatever your discipline is. And then the ICAP model, I get really excited about this. Micheline Chi, she's a fantastic cognitive scientist for the team. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but you'll notice that there's some similarity. So the first 3 are different subcategories. It's like a taxonomy of active learning. So the top one is interactive, where students are not just doing something on their own, but they're interacting with other students or with the teacher. They're not just making their own little contribution, but they're responding to the other student's contribution. That's the key there. They're creating jointly. And the evidence shows that this has the highest payoff in terms of student learning attainment. So that's a really good one if we can incorporate that. You may or may not have an opportunity to have students work in groups. If you don't, you can just go for the constructive level. So this is where they're producing output beyond the given information from the lecturer. So they're not just repeating back on the exam what you told them in lecture, but they have to go further than that. They're constructing their own knowledge. So inferring new knowledge, integrating the new with existing knowledge, restructuring their mental model. That's the mental schema. This is really valuable. So this is the constructive approach. They could do it individually or they could do it in groups. And then the third level that is still active is more of a behavioral type of being active. So might be a physical activity, could be underlying, manipulating objects, selecting, etc. So with that one, they're activating existing knowledge, they're storing new information, but at that one, they're not yet building the mental schemas. So that's the difference among these 3. And then with the passive one, you don't really have meaningful cognitive processes going on. You're just hoping they receive it and remember it. You're not really based on activities. So I highly recommend that you read her article on that, and we can give all the references and so on after the session. So my key message is that to help students learn the best, have them do an active cognitive task, not just passively absorb that information. And it really helps them if we can be explicit. about what we want them to do. As I said, the ones who need it the most are the least likely ones to do it on their own. The students who are already in that top tier, already getting a distinction, they probably are doing something like this out of their own initiative anyway. But it's the ones in the middle and the ones who need it the most that we can really help.